The more you try to be loved, the more fragile you become. Not because love is cruel, but because need distorts it. You start watching reactions, measuring words, waiting for signs that you are safe, valued, chosen. And slowly, without noticing, your emotional balance is no longer yours. It belongs to circumstances, to messages unanswered, to moods you cannot predict. This is not weakness. It is a misunderstanding of where power truly lives. Detachment is often mistaken for coldness, yet what you are about to hear will challenge that belief entirely. This is not about withdrawing from life or hardening yourself. It is about learning why emotional freedom creates closeness, while emotional hunger creates distance. By the end, you will not feel less capable of love. You will feel less controlled by fear. And that difference changes everything. Why attachment feels like love but is not. Attachment feels like love because it borrows its voice and wears its gestures. It speaks in concern, in attention, in intensity. It convinces you that constant thinking is devotion, that emotional dependence is depth, that fear of loss is proof of value. And because it feels sincere, it goes unquestioned. Yet sincerity alone does not make something true. Much of what we call love is simply anxiety looking for relief. When you are attached, your inner stability quietly moves outside of you. Your mood begins to respond to tone changes, pauses, distance, approval, rejection. You start adjusting yourself to preserve connection, not because you are dishonest, but because you are afraid. Afraid of absence, afraid of uncertainty, afraid of returning to yourself without the reassurance of being wanted. This fear disguises itself as care, but its function is regulation. You are not loving the other person freely. You are using the relationship to steady your internal state. This is why attachment exhausts you. It demands vigilance. You monitor signs, interpret silences, replay conversations. Your nervous system stays alert, waiting for confirmation that nothing has been lost. And when confirmation does not arrive, emotion fills the gap with stories that assume rejection, abandonment, or failure. None of this happens because you are weak. It happens because you have placed control where control does not exist. Epictetus explained this with brutal clarity when he taught that some things are up to us and others are not. He did not say this to make life smaller, but to make it livable. The moment you place your sense of worth, peace, or safety in another person's responses, you have assigned your well-being to something outside your command. From that moment on, anxiety is logical. You are guarding something fragile that you cannot secure. Attachment is often mistaken for emotional depth because it feels intense. But intensity is not intimacy. Intensity is pressure. Intimacy is presence. One is driven by fear of loss. The other is grounded in self-possession. When you are attached, you do not meet the other person as they are. You meet them as a potential threat to your emotional equilibrium. That changes how you listen, how you speak, how you love. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 2, Paragraph 1, that the mind becomes shaped by what it repeatedly focuses on. When your focus is centered on external validation, your mind trains itself to remain unsettled. You become skilled at worrying, anticipating, and bracing. This is not love growing, this is dependence deepening. Understanding this does not require self-accusation. There is nothing immoral about attachment. It is learned, it is reinforced, it is rewarded early in life. But it must be seen clearly if it is to loosen its grip. The moment you realize that attachment is an attempt to control emotional discomfort through external means, something important shifts. You stop fighting yourself. You stop condemning your feelings. You begin questioning the structure that produces them. Love does not require the surrender of inner authority. Love does not demand that you abandon yourself in order to be chosen. What feels like love but creates constant fear is not connection. It is negotiation. And the exhaustion you feel is not because you care too much. It is because you are carrying a burden that was never meant to be carried that way. Once this becomes clear, relief appears quietly. Not because the world changes, but because the problem is finally named correctly. You were not failing at love. You were asking love to do the work of self-governance, and that work belongs to you. The moment you gave away control. There is a moment, rarely dramatic, when control quietly leaves your hands. It does not happen during conflict or loss. It happens in small internal decisions that feel harmless at the time. You wait for a message and your chest tightens. You replay a conversation, searching for what you should have said differently. You sense distance and immediately begin adjusting yourself to close it. None of this feels like surrender. It feels like care. But this is the precise moment authority over your inner state is transferred. Control is not stolen from you. It is offered. You offer it when your emotional balance depends on how someone else behaves. You offer it when silence unsettles you more than truth. You offer it when your sense of worth rises and falls based on external response. This exchange is subtle, which is why it goes unnoticed. You believe you are responding to life, when in fact you are negotiating with fear. The Stoics understood this exchange with painful honesty. Epictetus did not describe loss of control as misfortune, but as confusion. He explained that when we treat what is not ours as if it were, suffering follows naturally. The mind reacts not because it is weak, but because it has been placed in an impossible position. You are asking it to secure outcomes it cannot command. Consider how often your attention moves outward. A delayed reply becomes a verdict. A change in tone becomes a threat. A difference in behavior becomes a story about your value. Each interpretation tightens the grip of emotion, and yet none of these events belong to you. They are not actions you chose. They are not judgments you made. They are facts happening outside your sphere. The distress comes not from the events, but from the belief that they must be managed to maintain inner stability. Marcus Aurelius warned himself repeatedly against this confusion. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 47, he reminded himself that if something is not within the will, it cannot harm the soul. Yet most harm we feel today is not physical or material. It is the harm of believing that peace must be defended externally. Once this belief settles in, life becomes a series of emotional emergencies. The realization that changes everything is not that you lack control, but that you misplaced it. You handed it to reactions, opinions, outcomes, and expectations. And because those things shift constantly, your inner state became unstable by design. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural one. You were taught implicitly that emotional security comes from being chosen, approved of, or understood. Stoicism challenges this assumption directly. It teaches that emotional security comes from clarity about what belongs to you. When this distinction becomes clear, something important happens. You stop arguing with reality. You stop demanding certainty from other people. You begin to see that peace was never supposed to be negotiated through response or attention. It was meant to be governed internally. This realization does not remove emotion. It removes panic. It replaces urgency with orientation. You begin to notice the difference between concern and control. Concern allows care without collapse. Control creates anxiety without power. Once you see how often you confuse the two, you gain the ability to pause. That pause is where freedom begins, not freedom from feeling, but freedom from being ruled by what you cannot command. You did not lose control. You can retrieve it the same way it was given away, by returning responsibility for your inner state back to where it belongs. And once that responsibility is reclaimed, detachment stops feeling like loss. It begins to feel like strength. Detachment as emotional ownership. Detachment is often feared because it is misunderstood. It is imagined as distance, coldness, or withdrawal. But true detachment has nothing to do with pushing people away. It is the act of taking responsibility for what is yours and refusing to place that burden on anyone else. Detachment is not emotional absence. It is emotional ownership. When you are detached, you stop asking others to regulate what you have not yet learned to govern. You no longer expect another person's presence to calm your anxiety or their affection to confirm your worth. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you honest. Honest about where your emotions originate and where they must be handled. You stop confusing connection with dependence. Attachment reacts. It reacts to tone, to delay, to uncertainty. It moves quickly, impulsively, driven by the need to restore comfort as soon as possible. Detachment responds. It creates space between stimulus and judgment. In that space, reason is allowed to enter, not to suppress feeling, but to guide it. This distinction is subtle, yet decisive. Reaction gives emotion command. Response gives emotion context. The Stoics never argued against emotion itself. They argued against surrendering judgment to it. Seneca wrote extensively about the danger of allowing passions to rule unchecked, not because they are evil, but because they are unstable. Emotions change rapidly. Reason remains available. Detachment is the practice of placing reason back in its rightful position as steward rather than servant. This is where many people resist. They fear that if they stop reacting emotionally, they will become less human, less warm, less capable of love. The opposite is true. When emotion no longer has to fight for control, it softens. When you stop clinging, you become present. Presence is what people feel as safety. It is what makes others lean in rather than pull away. Detachment does not remove desire. It removes desperation. Desperation pressures others to carry weight they did not agree to carry. Detachment lifts that weight. It allows relationships to breathe. When you no longer demand that someone complete you, you finally meet them as a whole person meeting another whole person. That is not distance. That is maturity. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea repeatedly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, paragraph 16, he reminded himself that the soul is dyed by the thoughts it holds. When your thoughts are consumed by outcomes and reactions, the soul becomes restless. When your thoughts are aligned with what you can govern, the soul steadies. Detachment is not an act toward others, it is an internal alignment. Emotional ownership means acknowledging what you feel without outsourcing its resolution. You can feel longing without demanding reassurance. You can feel affection without bargaining for security. You can feel fear without obeying it. This is not suppression. It is containment. And containment is what allows emotion to move through you without overwhelming you. As this ownership strengthens, something unexpected happens. You become easier to be with. Your presence no longer carries urgency. Your words no longer seek confirmation. You listen without waiting to be validated. This shift is subtle yet unmistakable. Others feel it immediately, even if they cannot name it. It is the calm of someone who is no longer negotiating their inner world through external means. Detachment is not the absence of care. It is care without fear. It is love without self-erasure. And once you experience this distinction, attachment begins to lose its grip naturally, not through force, but through understanding. You no longer need to cling to feel connected. You are already grounded where connection begins. Accepting fate without becoming passive. Acceptance is one of the most misunderstood ideas in Stoic philosophy. Many hear it and imagine surrender, weakness, or silence in the face of what hurts. But acceptance, as the Stoics understood it, is not submission. It is accuracy. It is seeing reality clearly, without distortion, without protest, without the added suffering that comes from demanding that life be different than it is. Most emotional exhaustion does not come from events themselves. It comes from resistance, from the inner argument that says this should not be happening, they should not be acting this way, I should not feel like this. Each of these thoughts creates friction between reality and expectation, and friction, sustained over time, becomes fatigue, resentment, and despair. Acceptance removes that friction, not by approving of everything that happens, but by refusing to fight what is already real. This distinction matters. You can accept that something is happening without agreeing that it should have happened. You can accept a loss without calling it fair. You can accept uncertainty without liking it. Acceptance is not moral endorsement, it is mental clarity. Epictetus spoke of this clarity when he taught that events themselves are neutral and that it is our judgments about them that disturb us. This is not a denial of pain, it is an invitation to stop multiplying it. When you accept fate, you stop adding emotional commentary to facts. You deal with what is in front of you, not with the version of reality you wish had occurred. Passivity comes from confusion. Acceptance comes from strength. A passive person disengages because they feel powerless. An accepting person acts where action is possible and releases what is not. This is the dichotomy of control lived in real time. You do not waste energy demanding control over outcomes. You invest energy in how you respond, decide, and behave. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this discipline constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 34, he wrote that the mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to its acting. What blocks the path becomes the path. This is not poetic optimism, it is practical resilience. When resistance ends, intelligence becomes available. Acceptance also transforms your relationship with emotion. When you stop arguing with fate, emotions lose their urgency. Sadness is allowed to exist without panic. Fear is noticed without obedience. Anger arises without taking command. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You choose responses instead of reacting blindly. Many people remain emotionally trapped because they believe that letting go means losing something essential. But what is actually lost is tension. When you accept that certain things are not yours to govern, your nervous system begins to relax. Not because life is suddenly easy, but because you are no longer fighting reality with imagination. Acceptance restores dignity. You no longer beg circumstances to change in order to feel stable. You meet them as they are, grounded in the knowledge that your character remains intact regardless of outcome. This is where quiet strength replaces inner chaos. Not the strength of domination, but the strength of alignment. You do not accept fate to become still. You accept fate to move correctly. When you stop wasting energy on what cannot be changed, you regain energy for what can. And this shift, once felt, is irreversible. Life continues to challenge you, but it no longer owns you. You stand within events instead of being dragged by them. Acceptance does not close your heart, it steadies it. And from that steadiness, every next step becomes clearer. Why detachment makes you more lovable? What draws people toward you is not effort, it is not intensity, it is not the careful management of how you are perceived. What attracts is stability, and stability is rare. When you are detached, not withdrawn but grounded, your presence carries no demand. There is no pressure to reassure you, to perform for you, to regulate your emotional state. This absence of pressure is felt immediately. It creates space. And space is where connection grows. Most people confuse being lovable with being needed. They believe that if someone depends on them, they must matter. But dependence is heavy. It asks for constant proof. Detachment removes that weight. When you are no longer seeking validation, your attention becomes clean. You listen without waiting for something in return. You speak without calculating impact. You care without bargaining. This changes the emotional climate around you. Detachment signals self-trust, and self-trust is calming. When someone feels that you are not emotionally at risk with them, they relax. They do not feel responsible for your happiness. They are free to show up honestly. This is why detachment deepens intimacy rather than destroying it. It removes fear from the interaction, fear of disappointing you, fear of losing you, fear of being misunderstood. Marcus Aurelius understood this dynamic intuitively. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, paragraph 68, he reflected on how a person grounded in reason becomes steady like a rock against which the waves break. This steadiness is not rigidity, it is reliability. People are drawn to those who remain themselves regardless of shifting conditions. Detachment also clarifies love. When you no longer need to be chosen to feel whole, you choose freely. Your affection is no longer a strategy for security. It is an expression of character. This is felt by others as sincerity. There is no hidden agenda beneath your kindness, no anxiety beneath your warmth, no urgency beneath your interest. Emotionally detached people do not chase. They do not withdraw either. They remain present. And presence is magnetic because it is undemanding. It allows others to move toward you without being pulled. This is not a technique. It is a consequence of inner order. When your inner world is governed, your outer interactions become natural. This is why detachment often results in being more loved, even though that is not its aim. When you stop needing a certain outcome, you stop distorting yourself to secure it. Others feel this alignment. They sense that you are not performing a role, you are simply there. And in a world filled with emotional noise, that simplicity stands out. Detachment does not guarantee affection. Stoicism never promised control over love. What it offers is dignity regardless of outcome. You become someone who can be appreciated without being consumed, desired without being depended upon, loved without being managed. That balance is rare, and rarity attracts attention. When you understand this, the paradox dissolves. Detachment does not push love away. It removes the behaviors that quietly repel it. You are no longer reaching from lack. You are standing from sufficiency. And that shift, once embodied, changes how every relationship unfolds. Practical Stoic reframe, one internal shift. Most emotional spirals do not begin with events. They begin with confusion. Confusion about what belongs to you and what does not. When this line is blurred, the mind rushes to fix, control, anticipate, and defend. It feels urgent because it believes something essential is at risk. The Stoic reframe does not calm you by force. It restores orientation. The shift is simple but not easy. Each time emotion rises, you ask one honest question: is this within my control or only within my concern? This question is not meant to suppress feeling. It is meant to place it correctly. The moment you ask it, the mind slows. Reaction pauses, space appears, and in that space, reason returns to its role. If something is within your control, your actions, your judgments, your values, then emotion becomes information. You act, you decide, you correct. But if something is only within your concern, someone else's response, the future, the outcome of your effort, then emotion must be allowed without obedience. You feel it, acknowledge it, and refuse to let it issue commands. This is not detachment from life. It is detachment from illusion. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around this distinction because he understood the cost of ignoring it. When you treat concern as control, you live in constant tension. You argue with time. You bargain with people. You exhaust yourself rehearsing futures that may never arrive. The Stoic reframe cuts through this habit without cruelty. It simply asks you to stop demanding power where none exists. This question also reveals how much suffering is self-generated. Not intentionally, but structurally. You suffer not because you care, but because you believe caring requires control. Once that belief is challenged, emotion begins to reorganize itself. Anxiety loses its authority. It still appears, but it no longer drives. Fear still arises, but it is no longer obeyed. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional hierarchy. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 32, he reminded himself that the disturbance does not come from the thing itself, but from the judgment about it. The practical reframe is the moment when judgment is questioned before it solidifies into suffering. You do not argue with the emotion. You question the assumption beneath it. This shift changes daily life in quiet ways. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop rehearsing explanations. You stop bracing for rejection before it happens. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you recognize what is yours to govern. Your effort becomes cleaner. Your attention becomes steadier. Your reactions become slower and more accurate. Over time, this question becomes instinctive. It does not remove difficulty, but it prevents collapse. You remain engaged without being entangled. You care without clinging. You act without demanding guarantees. This is what Stoic strength looks like in practice. Not dramatic restraint, but consistent clarity. The power of this reframe is not that it solves every problem. It is that it prevents problems from invading your inner authority. Once you understand this, emotional storms lose their ability to disorient you. They pass through without uprooting you, and that is the kind of stability no circumstance can take away. Quiet empowerment. What you have been guided toward is not a technique, a mindset trick, or a temporary calm. It is a return to the place where authority was always meant to live, within your judgment, within your character, within your capacity to respond rather than react. Nothing outside of you was ever meant to carry the weight of your inner balance. Detachment, as you now understand it, is not emotional distance, it is emotional order. It is the decision to stop confusing intensity with depth, need with love, and anxiety with care. When you release the demand that life, people, or outcomes must behave a certain way for you to be at peace, something stabilizes quietly. You stop fighting what is, you start working with what is. This does not make you passive, it makes you precise. You act where action belongs. You accept where acceptance is required. You feel without being overtaken. You care without clinging. This is not resignation, it is alignment. Alignment between your values and your reactions. Alignment between reason and emotion. Alignment between who you are and how you live. Marcus Aurelius wrote for himself, not for an audience, in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 12, Paragraph 1, that the soul becomes dyed by the quality of its thoughts. What you repeatedly tell yourself about control, loss, love, and fear becomes the structure of your inner life. When those thoughts are disciplined, life becomes lighter, not easier, but lighter to carry. You do not leave this understanding with guarantees. Stoicism never offered them. What you leave with is something stronger, the ability to remain whole regardless of outcome, to be steady even when uncertainty remains, to love without losing yourself, to be present without bargaining for security. That is freedom in its most practical form. Finally, the greatest shift is this. You stop asking the world to calm you. You become calm enough to meet the world as it is. From that place, detachment is no longer something you try to practice. It becomes how you move, how you choose, how you love. Quietly, firmly, without fear.